Hi guys, my name is Laura Leslie and I did my book review over C.S. Lewis's book called The Abolition of Man. Now, Clive Staples Lewis, later known as C.S. Lewis, seemed to be a man before his own time when it came to philosophical truths. While he was a tutor at Oxford, he began to give lectures that were so awe-inspiring that they were later published into works of literature that have again and again been regularly printed into multiple editions worldwide. One of the lecture series that was recorded was published into a work that Lewis titled The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of Man consists of foundational and philosophical truths for some and confusion for others. Many see this work as the peak of Lewis's mind when it was moving at its best. The abolition of man is debated, yet respected by many and used widely for cultural and universal beliefs. Now a little bit about C.S. Lewis' biography. On November 29, 1898, Clive Staples was born in Ireland. In 1905, his dad, his mom, and his older brother moved to the outer edges of Belfast. C.S. Lewis then enrolled into Wynyard School. 2 years later, he enrolled at Campbell College as a boarding student. Lewis began to have respiratory issues, therefore he was sent to Malvern, England, where he later enrolled into Malvern College in 1913. It was during his time there that Lewis abandoned his childhood Christian faith, but also where he met his closest and dearest friend, Arthur Greeves. Lewis took private lessons from W.T. Kilpatrick in 1914, and in 1917, Lewis became an Oxford student until he enlisted into the British Army, where he was accommodated for officer training at Keble College. Lewis ended up getting wounded and was discharged. Lewis went back to Oxford, where he became a tutor. In 1929, C.S. Lewis became a theist and returned to his roots of Christianity. In 1946, Lewis was granted an honorary doctorate of divinity by the University of St. Andrews. In 1950, C.S. Lewis announced his most well-known fiction book called The Chronicles of Narnia, which secretly unveils the message of the gospel. In 1959, Lewis was yet again presented an honorary Doctorate of Letters by Laval University in Quebec. In 1954, Lewis left Oxford and became the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. On April 23, 1953, Lewis marries his wife Joy Grisham. In 1959, C.S. Lewis was bestowed a Doctorate of Literature by the University of Manchester. Lewis was only married to his wife for 4 years before she passed away in 1960, and Lewis's death seemed to decline after her death because he died 3 years later in 1963 at the age of 64. Now, a summary of The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of Man is separated into 3 different parts that help the audience move at the pace of C.S. Lewis himself. The first of these parts is labeled Men Without Chest. Lewis seems to be insulting or belittling the authors of a children's book that he seems to personally know. He does not use the authors' names, but instead names them Gaius and Titius, while also naming their book The Green Book. Gaius and Titius, according to Lewis, use the word sublime while describing a waterfall in the book. This is where it seems to go wrong for Lewis. Mr. Lewis goes further in this part by discussing how Gaius and Titius are using emotionally driven words to entice certain emotions on their adolescent audience. Lewis does state that the author using the word sublime was not meaning to push his emotions on the reader, but just give a description of what he was describing. He uses the author's description of death being dulce and how it simply cannot be due to the fact that dulce is not something to eat and therefore cannot be dulce. Lewis's point in discussing these authors' motives is that when man uses emotionally driven words to describe such things, it seems to take the heart out of the adolescent, thus not allowing them to develop their own emotions as they develop into adulthood. The second part of this book, which is the second lecture that C.S. Lewis gives, is called The Way. Lewis bled Lecture 1 over into Lecture 2 with his passion on emotions, but it takes a step further in the way by holding ethics and moral reasoning to the standard of the Taio. He states that practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Taio which he has set out to succeed. Lewis presents his views in this lecture that holding the standard of the Taio in one's own life and how everything that comes from within the mind, whether that be ideas, reasoning, or moral values, is established from within the tayo itself. He believes that going against the tayo is like a branch that goes against the tree. But outside the tayo, there is no ground for criticism either the tayo or anything else. But outside the tayo, there is no ground. Outside of the tayo, there is no ground for criticism other the tayo or anything else. This is the point of the entire lecture that Lewis is trying to make, which he repeats over and over again for the remainder of the lecture, that the tayo is essentially the tree from which all the values and standards of the branch off of. The third lecture is the ultimate finale to the lecture series, where the title of the published work comes from The Abolition of Man. Mr. Lewis hits on the abuse of man, of nature, and how some use nature to overpower other men. He calls the specific men conditioners, because they condition the situation to sway in their direction. But Lewis takes what the conditioners do and tell his audience why the conditioners are doing wrong in this. Conditioners typically do not take from the tayo, at least I think according to Lewis. He states that in order to create a value or thought like the conditioners do, one has to take from the original tayo. When man tries to not do this, this is what's resulting in the ending of man. Man thus stops himself from furthering on because he is trying to dive so deep into a value or to create new values, resulting in no further growth. Lewis ends the lecture by reminding his audience the dangers of dominating nature. Now for my response to the abolition of man. Based on C.S. Lewis' main points of the abolition of man, there becomes topics to discuss and points to stand on. When C.S. Lewis discusses how the authors of Gaius and Titius misplace true and false emotions with only true emotions, this becomes a catastrophe because the children are being taught that only their emotions are true. I can help but stand with Lewis on this argument because emotions are not universal. For example, if I said this blanket is delicate, this could be a false emotion for someone else, or it could persuade someone to feel how I feel instead of having their own emotions of the blanket. Therefore, our logic and emotions are in constant battle. The tayo is very clear because C.S. Lewis believes everything is derived from the tayo. Lewis uses the tayo for what is culturally moral, and when people try to go outside of the tayo, they are contradicting themselves because challenging the tayo is like challenging creation. We cannot create something new like a pink-spotted dog. We can only use our imagination or paint a dog with pink spots, but the dog will always be derived from the original tayo. The abolition of man, which is the third part of the lecture, conveys between nature and man's power. C.S. Lewis lectures that if a man tries to control nature, the man will lose himself in the process. We as people condition ourselves to think we can control the world around us, but if we try to, we lose who we really are. For example, a student at Oxford is in a controlled environment of strict studying of mathematics. This student will grow up knowing a lot of math, yet will lack in real-world application. Thus, the student will only know how to operate in that environment, and his power as a man will be lost to the forces of his surroundings. So to conclude, the abolition of man was quite a bit confusing at first until you grasp C.S. Lewis' points of meaning. C.S. Lewis conquered nature by provoking the mind and allowing people to think about what they stand for. The word abolition means to stop something, and I believe Lewis was trying to stop mankind from finding an answer to everything. Because when people try to find an answer to everything, they end up explaining away forever, and then you've explained explanation itself away. Therefore, go with the way of the tayo. Thanks for